She found it wrapped in yellow newspaper, buried beneath floorboards that hadn't been touched in 60 years. A necklace. Simple. Tarnished. And inside the clasp, 3 words were scratched so faintly she almost missed them. "Forgive me, Elena." Her mother had been dead for 2 weeks. Margaret stood in the attic of her childhood home, dust motes spinning in the autumn light that leaked through a cracked window. The house smelled like her mother, lavender soap and old books, and something else. Something that clung to the walls like memory itself. She hadn't wanted to come back here. Not after the funeral. Not after the hospital room where her mother's last breath had been so quiet. Margaret almost missed it, leaning forward, whispering, "Mom? Mom, I'm here." But there were things to sort. A house to empty. 63 years of life packed into rooms that suddenly felt too small and too large all at once. The floorboard had creaked under her weight, a loose plank near the corner where her mother's old sewing table used to sit. Margaret knelt, pressed her palm flat against the wood, and felt it give slightly. Curious. She pried it up with the edge of a screwdriver she'd found downstairs. And there it was. A small wooden box. No bigger than her hand. The kind that might have once held tea or tobacco. The newspaper wrapped around it was dated April 1944. The ink had faded to a ghostly brown, but she could still make out the headline, "Allied forces push forward, victory within reach." Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside, nestled on a bed of frayed velvet, was a necklace. A single pearl on a delicate gold chain. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that would catch your eye in a jewelry store window. But when she turned the clasp over, she saw them. 3 words. Etched by an unsteady hand. "Forgive me, Elena." Margaret's breath caught. Elena. That was her mother's name. Margaret sat back on her heels, the necklace draped across her palm like a question she didn't know how to ask. Her mother had never been one for jewelry. She wore her wedding ring, gold, simple, worn thin over 5 decades, and nothing else. Not earrings. Not bracelets. Certainly not pearls. And she had never, not once in Margaret's 52 years of life, mentioned hiding anything. Her mother was orderly. Transparent. The kind of woman who labeled her spice jars and kept receipts in alphabetical order. So why this? Why hidden? Why forgive me? Margaret turned the necklace over in her hands, searching for more clues. The pearl was real, she could tell by the weight of it, and the faint imperfections in its surface. The chain was old but well made. European, maybe? She pulled out her phone and took a photo of the inscription, then hesitated. Who could she ask? Her father had died 8 years ago. Her mother's friends, the few who were still alive, were scattered, lost to time and distance. And her mother had been an only child. No siblings. No cousins Margaret had ever met. The family tree, as far as Margaret knew, was a short one. But now, holding this necklace, she wondered what else she didn't know. What else had been buried beneath the floorboards of her mother's life? Margaret took the box downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. The same table where she'd eaten breakfast as a child, where her mother had rolled out dough for Christmas cookies, and where they'd sat together just 3 months ago, her mother's hands shaking too much to hold her teacup steady. "I'm tired, Maggie," her mother had whispered that day. So tired. Margaret had held her hand. Said nothing. Because what do you say when someone is letting go? Now, she wished she'd asked more questions. She opened her laptop and typed, "Pearl necklace 1940s Europe." The search results were overwhelming. Thousands of images. Auction sites. Antique dealers. Nothing helpful. She tried again, "Forgive me, Elena necklace." Nothing. She sat back, frustrated, and stared at the box. Then she noticed something she'd missed before. A small mark on the bottom of the wooden box. Burned into the wood, faint but unmistakable. A symbol. 2 overlapping circles. And inside them, a tiny star. Margaret's heart began to race. She'd seen that symbol before. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the hallway closet. It was stuffed with her mother's coats, heavy wool, decades out of style, but her mother had never thrown anything away. Margaret pushed them aside, reaching toward the back, where a cardboard box sat wedged against the wall. She pulled it out, coughing at the dust that rose in a cloud around her. The box was labeled in her mother's neat handwriting, "Old papers, do not throw away." Margaret had always assumed it was tax documents or receipts. Boring things? She opened it. And inside, beneath a stack of yellowed envelopes and faded photographs, was a small leather journal. The cover was cracked. The pages were brittle. And on the first page, in ink that had barely survived the decades, was a name. Elena Kováč. And beneath it, the same symbol. 2 overlapping circles. A star. Margaret's hands were shaking now. Kováč. That wasn't her mother's maiden name. Her mother's maiden name was Bennett. American. Plain. English. Wasn't it? She opened the journal carefully, afraid the pages might crumble under her touch. The first entry was dated March 3, 1943. The handwriting was her mother's, younger, steadier, but unmistakably hers. "They came today. I heard them on the stairs. I thought they were looking for father, but they were looking for me. They said my name, my real name, and I knew it was over." Margaret's breath caught. She turned the page. "Mama gave me the necklace this morning. She said, 'Hide this. No matter what happens, hide this. It is all I have left of my mother, and all I can give you of home.' I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell her we would survive this together. But I saw the fear in her eyes. And I knew she was saying goodbye." Margaret's throat tightened. She turned another page. "Father is gone. Mama won't tell me where. She says it's safer if I don't know. I think he's dead. I think they took him in the night, and she couldn't bear to tell me." Margaret's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes and kept reading. "We leave tomorrow. Mama has arranged papers, new names, new lives. I will no longer be Elena Kováč. I will be Helen Bennett. American. Safe. Invisible. I will forget who I was. I will forget the language, the songs, and the smell of Mama's kitchen. I will forget everything. Because that is how you survive." Margaret closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. Her mother, her quiet, orderly, unremarkable mother, had been someone else entirely. Margaret spent the next hour reading. The journal was a record of escape, of terror, of a young girl, barely 16, fleeing a country that no longer wanted her. Elena, Helen, had come to America with her mother in the summer of 1944. They had landed in New York with nothing but false papers and the clothes on their backs. Elena's father had been taken by soldiers. Her mother never said where. Never said if he was alive or dead. They settled in a small town in Pennsylvania. Took new names. Learned to speak English without an accent. Elena's mother worked in a factory. Elena went to school, kept her head down, and smiled when people asked where she was from. "Ohio," she would say. "Just a small town. Nothing special." And people believed her. Because who would suspect a girl with perfect English and a perfect smile of being anything other than American? But at night, Elena would take out the necklace. She would hold it in her hands and remember. Remember her grandmother, who had given it to her mother. Remember the smell of bread baking in the old kitchen. Remember the songs her father used to sing. And she would cry. Quietly. So her mother wouldn't hear. Margaret closed the journal and stared at the necklace. "Forgive me, Elena." Who had written that? Her grandmother? Someone else? She turned back to the journal, flipping through the pages, searching for more clues. And then, near the end, she found it. An entry dated October 12, 1945. "Mama is gone. She died last night. Quietly. In her sleep. The doctor said it was her heart. But I think it was grief. I think she held on as long as she could, and when she knew I was safe, she let go. Before she died, she gave me the necklace one last time. She said, 'This is all I have left of my mother. And all I can give you of home.' But Elena, You must promise me. You must promise me you will let go. You must live. You must be Helen. Not for me. Not for your father. For yourself. Because the past will destroy you if you let it. I promised her. And then I hid the necklace. I couldn't bear to look at it. I couldn't bear to remember. So I wrapped it in newspaper and I put it beneath the floorboards and I told myself I would never think of it again. Forgive me, Mama. Forgive me for being too weak to carry the past. Forgive me for choosing survival over memory. Margaret's tears fell onto the page, smudging the ink. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, the journal open in front of her, the necklace in her hand, and she tried to reconcile the woman she had known with the girl in these pages. Her mother, Helen, had never spoken of the war. Never mentioned Europe. Never hinted at a life before America. Margaret had asked once, when she was a teenager, why they didn't have any extended family. Her mother had smiled, a small, sad smile, and said, "Sometimes families are small, sweetheart. That's just how it is." And Margaret had accepted it. Because her mother was happy. Her parents were happy. They had built a quiet, unremarkable life in a quiet, unremarkable town. But now, Margaret understood. Her mother hadn't been quiet because she was boring. She'd been quiet because she was hiding. Hiding from a past that could have destroyed her. Hiding from memories that were too painful to carry. And the necklace, the one thing she had kept from that life, had been too heavy to wear. So she had buried it. And with it, she had buried Elena. Margaret stood and walked to the window. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She thought of her mother. Thought of the girl who had fled her home with nothing but a necklace and a new name. Thought of the woman who had built a life from scratch, who had smiled through grief, who had loved her daughter fiercely, quietly, without ever asking for recognition or pity. Margaret opened the clasp of the necklace and fastened it around her neck. The pearl was cool against her skin. She looked at her reflection in the window. And for the first time, she saw her mother clearly. Not as Helen Bennett, the quiet housewife, but as Elena Kováč, the girl who had survived. Margaret spent the next few days going through the house with new eyes. She found more pieces of the puzzle. A photograph, tucked into the back of a frame, of a young woman standing in front of a bakery. The sign was in a language Margaret didn't recognize, but she guessed it was Czech or Slovak. The woman in the photo looked like her mother. Same eyes. Same smile. On the back, in faded pencil, Mama. Prague. 1938. She found letters too. Hidden in the bottom of a trunk in the basement. Written in a language Margaret couldn't read, but the handwriting was familiar. Her grandmother's, she guessed. She took photos of everything and sent them to a translator she found online. The response came 2 days later. The letters were from Elena's grandmother to Elena's mother. Written between 1940 and 1942. Before the family had to flee. They were full of ordinary things. Recipes. Gossip. Worries about the weather. But the last letter was different. It was dated January 1943. The translator's note said, "This letter is difficult to translate directly, but the essence is this: the grandmother is saying goodbye. She knows she will not survive what is coming. She gives her daughter the necklace and tells her to keep it for Elena. She says, this is all I can give her of me. Tell her I loved her. Tell her to live." Margaret read the translation 3 times. Then she sat down and cried. Not for the life her mother had lost, but for the strength it must have taken to let it go. Margaret couldn't let it go. The more she uncovered, the more questions bloomed in her mind like flowers after rain, beautiful and impossible to ignore. She sat at her mother's old desk, surrounded by fragments of a life she'd never known existed. Photographs. Letters in languages she couldn't speak. A faded passport with her mother's face, younger, thinner, frightened, but a different name beneath it. Elena Marie Kováč. Born April 17, 1927. Prague, Czechoslovakia. Margaret traced her finger over the photograph. Her mother couldn't have been more than 16 when this was taken. Her eyes were darker then. Haunted. Nothing like the soft, gentle eyes Margaret had known. What had those eyes seen? What had they witnessed that was so terrible her mother had spent 50 years trying to forget? Margaret picked up her phone. She needed answers. Real answers. The kind that couldn't be found in dusty journals or faded letters. She typed, Holocaust Survivors Czech Republic 1943. The results made her stomach turn. Deportations. Camps. Mass graves. Families torn apart in the middle of the night. Children who never came home. Margaret's hands trembled as she scrolled through page after page of history. History that had been her mother's life. And then she found something. A database. The central database of Shoah victims' names. Her heart was pounding now. She typed slowly, afraid of what she might find. Kovač. The search results loaded. 17 names. She scanned the list, her breath catching in her throat. Kovač Joseph. Born 1899. Deported from Prague, 1943. Murdered in Auschwitz, 1943. Margaret's vision blurred. Joseph. Her grandfather. Her mother's father. The man Elena had written about in her journal. The man who had been taken in the night. He hadn't disappeared. He had been murdered. And her mother had known. Margaret closed her laptop. She couldn't look anymore. She walked outside, into the garden her mother had tended for 40 years. The roses were overgrown now, wild and untamed without her mother's careful hands to guide them. Margaret sat on the wooden bench her father had built decades ago, the necklace still around her neck, and she let herself cry. She cried for the grandfather she'd never known existed. She cried for the grandmother who had given away her most precious possession so her daughter might have something to remember her by. She cried for her mother, for Elena, who had carried this weight alone, in silence, for her entire life. Margaret had thought her mother's life was simple, unremarkable, safe. But it wasn't simple. It was a masterpiece of survival. Every smile her mother had given, every meal she'd cooked, every bedtime story she'd told Margaret when she was small. All of it had been built on top of a foundation of loss so deep, so profound, that Margaret could barely comprehend it. And her mother had never said a word, never asked for sympathy, never used her pain as an excuse. She had simply lived. She had chosen life over memory, hope over grief, love over bitterness. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked up at the sky. "How did you do it, Mom?" she whispered. "How did you carry all of that and still manage to smile?" The wind rustled through the leaves. No answer came. But Margaret felt something shift inside her. A new kind of respect. A new kind of love. For the woman who had been her mother. And for the girl who had survived. Margaret spent the next week researching. She contacted the Holocaust Museum in Washington. She spoke with a historian who specialized in Czech Jewish families. She sent copies of the letters to be translated properly, not just by an online service, but by someone who understood the context, the history, and the weight of every word. And slowly, piece by piece, Elena's story came into focus. The Kovač family had lived in Prague for generations. They owned a small bakery in the Jewish quarter. Elena's grandfather, Margaret's great-grandfather, had been a baker. Her grandmother had run the shop, greeting customers with warmth and fresh challah every Friday. They weren't wealthy. They weren't famous. They were ordinary. Until they weren't allowed to be. In 1939, the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia. The bakery was seized. The family was forced into a ghetto. And then, one by one, they were taken. Elena's grandparents first. In 1942. Sent to their Scienstadt, then Auschwitz. They didn't survive. Elena's father, Joseph, tried to get his wife and daughter out. He had connections, friends who could forge papers and smuggle them across borders. But he ran out of time. In January 1943, the Gestapo came for him. Elena's mother, Anna, begged them to take her instead. They laughed. And they took Joseph anyway, Anna never saw him again. But she didn't give up. She used every contact she had, spent every bit of money hidden in the walls, and finally, in the summer of 1944, she secured 2 sets of false papers. For herself. And for Elena. They would no longer be Jewish. They would no longer be Czech. They would be American refugees, fleeing the war. Helen and Anna Bennett. Mother and daughter. From Ohio. It was a lie that saved their lives. The historian Margaret had been working with called her on a Tuesday afternoon. "Margaret, I found something," he said, his voice careful. "I'm not sure how you'll feel about it, but I think you should know." Margaret's heart sank. "What is it?" "I found a letter. Written by your grandmother, Elena Kováč, in 1946. It was donated to the museum years ago as part of a collection of survivor testimonies. I cross-referenced the name with the information you gave me, and I'm certain it's her." Margaret sat down. "What does it say?" "I can send you a copy, but..." "Margaret, she talks about Elena. About the guilt she felt for surviving when so many didn't. She talks about the necklace." Margaret's breath caught. "Tell me." The historian paused. She writes, "I gave Elena my mother's necklace before we left Prague. It was all I had left of her. All I had left of home. But I shouldn't have given it to her. It was too heavy. Not the necklace itself, the memory. I watched my daughter bury it beneath the floorboards of our new home, and I didn't stop her. Because I understood. The past is a weight we cannot always carry. And sometimes, to survive, we must bury it. I only hope that one day, someone will find it. And they will know. They will know we were here. We were loved. We mattered." Margaret couldn't speak. Her throat was tight. Her eyes burned. "Margaret? Are you there?" "Yes," she whispered. "I'm here. I'm sending you the full letter. Along with some other documents we have on file. Your family's story, it's important. It deserves to be remembered." "Thank you," Margaret managed. "Thank you?" She hung up. And she sat in her mother's kitchen, the necklace around her neck, and she finally understood. Her grandmother hadn't written, "Forgive me, Elena," as an apology for giving her the necklace. She had written it as an apology for the weight it carried. For the memories it held. For the grief it represented. And her mother, Elena, had buried it. Not because she didn't love her grandmother, but because she loved herself enough to survive. Margaret walked through the house one last time before the estate's sale. She decided to sell it. Not because she didn't love it, but because it wasn't hers to keep. It had been her mother's sanctuary. Her hiding place. The place where Elena Kováč had become Helen Bennett, and had stayed Helen Bennett for 60 years. But Margaret didn't need to hide. She didn't need to bury the past. She needed to honor it. She'd already donated most of her mother's papers to the Holocaust Museum. The letters, the journal, the photographs. They would be preserved. Catalogued. Studied. Her family's story would be told. Not as a tragedy, but as a testament. To survival. To resilience. To the quiet, unshakable strength of a girl who had lost everything and still chose to build a life. Margaret stopped in the attic, where she'd first found the necklace. The floorboard had been nailed back down. The space beneath it was empty now. But the memory remained. She touched the necklace at her throat. It didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt like a gift. 3 months later, Margaret received a package. It was from the Holocaust Museum. Inside was a letter and a small framed photograph. The letter was from the historian. "Dear Margaret, after cataloging your mother's papers, we were contacted by a woman named Ruth Steinberg. She's 91 years old and living in Tel Aviv. She saw your grandmother's letter in our database and reached out to us. Ruth says she knew your family. She lived in the same building as the Kovács in Prague before the war. She and your mother were childhood friends. She's included a photograph. She thought you'd want to have it. With warm regards, Dr. Michael Rosen." Margaret's hands shook as she opened the frame. The photograph was old, black and white, faded at the edges. It showed two little girls, no more than 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a bakery. They were holding hands, both smiling. One of them was her mother. Margaret could tell by the eyes. On the back of the photograph, in careful handwriting, was a note. To Margaret, "Your mother was my best friend. We played together every day until the war tore us apart. I survived Auschwitz. Your mother survived by leaving. We both carried guilt for the rest of our lives, me for surviving the camp, her for escaping it. But I want you to know something. Your mother was brave. Braver than anyone I ever knew. She didn't just survive. She lived. She loved. She built a beautiful life. I never forgot her. And I'm so grateful to know her story is being remembered. With love, Ruth." Margaret sat down and cried. But this time, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. Because her mother's story hadn't been lost. It had been found. And now, it will live on. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Ruth. A woman her mother's age. A woman who had survived the very thing her mother had escaped. A woman who still remembered. She wrote back immediately. "Dear Ruth, thank you for the photograph. Thank you for remembering my mother. I can't tell you what it means to know she wasn't alone in her memories, that someone else carried her story too. If you're willing, I'd love to hear more. About my mother. About your friendship. About whatever you're comfortable sharing. With deep gratitude, Margaret." Ruth's response came 2 weeks later. Not a letter this time. A phone call. Margaret answered on the second ring. "Hello? Margaret?" The voice was soft, accented, but steady. "This is Ruth." Margaret's breath caught. "Ruth. Thank you for calling. I don't even know what to say." "Then let me talk," Ruth said gently. "Let me tell you about your mother. About Elena." And she did. For 2 hours Ruth talked. She told Margaret about the games they used to play in the courtyard of their building. About the songs Elena's father would sing while he kneaded dough in the bakery. About the day the soldiers came and how Ruth's mother had grabbed her hand and pulled her inside, whispering, "Don't look. Don't look." She told Margaret about the guilt. About surviving when so many hadn't. About the nightmares that never quite went away. "But your mother," Ruth said, her voice breaking slightly, "your mother found peace. I could tell from the letters in the museum. She let herself live. She let herself love. That's the hardest thing to do after something like that. And she did it." Margaret wiped her eyes. "She never told me," Margaret whispered. "She never said a word." "Of course she didn't," Ruth said softly. "Because she didn't want you to carry it. She wanted you to be free." Margaret closed her eyes. "I wish I could have known her," Ruth continued. "The woman she became. Not just the girl I remember. I wish I could have told her. I wish I could have told her I was proud of her." "I think she knew," Margaret said quietly. "I think somehow she knew." Margaret's daughter, Sophie, came to visit a month later. She was 28. A teacher. Busy with her own life. But she'd heard about the necklace. And she wanted to know. Margaret sat with her at the kitchen table. Her kitchen table now, in her own home, and she told her everything. About Elena. About the war. About the necklace buried beneath the floorboards. About the grandmother. Sophie had never known she was someone entirely different than she'd imagined. Sophie listened, her eyes wide, her hand covering her mouth. When Margaret finished, Sophie reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "Why didn't Grandma ever tell us?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Because she wanted us to be happy. She didn't want us to carry her pain." "But it's not just pain," Sophie said, her voice fierce. "It's history. It's family. It's important." "I know," Margaret said. "That's why I'm telling you now." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the necklace. She'd worn it every day since she found it. But now, she placed it in Sophie's hand. "This is yours now," Margaret said. "Not to bury. Not to hide. To wear. To remember." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Mom, I can't. It's too. You can't," Margaret said firmly. "Because you're strong enough. Because we're all strong enough." Grandma thought the past was too heavy to carry. But she was wrong. It's not heavy. It's a gift. A reminder. Of where we come from. Of what we survived. Sophie fastened the necklace around her neck. The pearl caught the light. "Tell me more," Sophie said quietly. "Tell me everything." And Margaret did. 2 years later, Margaret stood in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. She was at the opening of a new exhibit, Voices of Survival, Untold Stories of Resistance and Resilience. Her mother's story was part of it. A small display case held the journal, the letters, and the photographs. And the necklace. Sophie had agreed to loan it to the museum for the exhibit. "So other people can see it," she'd said. "So they can know." Margaret stood in front of the display, reading the placard beside it. Elena Kováč, later known as Helen Bennett, fled Prague with her mother in 1944 using false papers. She spent the rest of her life in Pennsylvania, rarely speaking of her past. This necklace, hidden for 60 years, represents not only the weight of memory but also the strength required to let go in order to survive. Her story reminds us that survival takes many forms, and that choosing life, even in the face of unimaginable loss, is its own form of resistance. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. She turned. An elderly woman stood there, leaning on a cane. Her eyes were bright and curious. "Excuse me," the woman said. Are you family?" Margaret nodded. "She was my mother." The woman's face softened. "I'm a survivor too," she said quietly. "I lost everyone. My parents. My siblings. I came to America with nothing." She looked at the necklace in the case. "I buried things too," she whispered. "Things I couldn't bear to look at. Things that reminded me of what I'd lost." She turned to Margaret. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for sharing her story. For not letting it stay buried." Margaret reached out and took the woman's hand. "Thank you for surviving," Margaret said. "Thank you for being here." They stood together in silence, two strangers connected by history, by loss, and by the unbreakable thread of memory. Margaret didn't expect what happened next. The exhibit opened on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, her phone was ringing. A journalist from the Washington Post wanted to interview her. A documentary filmmaker was interested in telling Elena's story. A high school teacher in Maryland had brought her entire class to see the exhibit, and wanted to invite Margaret to speak. "I don't understand," Margaret told Sophie over the phone that night. "Why does this matter so much to people? It was just one family. One story." Sophie's voice was gentle but firm. "Mom, that's exactly why it matters. Because it wasn't just one family. It was thousands of families. Millions. And most of their stories were never told. Grandma's story gives voice to all of them." Margaret sat down, the weight of it settling over her. She'd thought finding the necklace was the end of the story. But it was just the beginning. Within 2 weeks, Margaret had given 3 interviews. The first was with the journalist from the Post. A young woman named Rachel, whose own grandparents had survived the camps. She listened to Margaret's story with tears streaming down her face, her recorder balanced on the table between them. "My grandmother never talked about it either," Rachel said when Margaret finished. "She died when I was 15, and I never got to ask her. Reading your mother's journal, it's like hearing my grandmother's voice for the first time." The article ran the following Sunday. The headline read, "The Necklace Beneath the Floorboards, One Family's Story of Survival, Silence, and the Weight of Memory." Margaret's phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days. The second interview was with the documentary filmmaker, a man named David Roth, whose father had been a hidden child during the war in Poland. "These stories are disappearing," David told Margaret as they sat in her living room, his camera crew setting up around them. The survivors are dying. Their children are growing older. If we don't capture these stories now, the personal ones, the intimate ones, they'll be lost forever. Margaret showed him everything. The journal. The letters. The photographs Ruth had sent her. She showed him the floorboard in her mother's house. The estate's sale had fallen through, and Margaret had decided to keep the house after all, turning it into a place where she could preserve her mother's memory. David filmed it all. "This isn't just history," he said as they wrapped for the day. "This is love. The love your great-grandmother had for your grandmother. The love your grandmother had for your mother. The love your mother had for you. That's what survived the war. Not just people. Love." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. The third interview was the hardest. It was with the high school teacher, Mrs. Patricia Coleman, and her students. Margaret stood in front of 30 teenagers, the necklace around her neck, and she told them her mother's story. She told them about Elena, about Joseph and Anna, about the bakery in Prague and the soldiers who came in the night. She told them about the necklace hidden beneath the floorboards. And she told them about silence. About how her mother had chosen not to speak because speaking hurt too much. About how Margaret had lived 52 years without knowing who her mother really was. When she finished, the room was silent. Then a girl in the front row raised her hand. "Yes?" Margaret said. The girl's voice was quiet, uncertain. "My grandfather came here from Vietnam. He never talks about the war. He never talks about what happened to his family. I always thought it was because he didn't care. But maybe it's because it hurts too much?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she said softly. "Maybe it does." Another student raised his hand. "Do you think your mom regretted not telling you?" Margaret thought about it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think she did what she thought was right. She wanted me to have a happy childhood. A normal life. She didn't want me to grow up in the shadow of her pain. But don't you wish she'd known?" A girl in the back asked. Margaret nodded. "Every day. But I also understand why she didn't tell me. Survival isn't just about living. It's about finding a way to keep living. And for my mother, that meant letting go of the past. Even if it meant I never knew." The room was quiet again. Then Mrs. Coleman spoke. "What do you want us to take away from this, Margaret? What do you want these students to remember?" Margaret looked at the faces in front of her. So young. So full of life. "I want you to remember that everyone has a story," she said. "Your grandparents. Your parents. The quiet person sitting next to you on the bus. Everyone is carrying something. And sometimes, the heaviest things are the ones we can't see." She touched the necklace. "And I want you to remember that it's okay to ask. It's okay to listen. Because the worst thing we can do is let these stories disappear." That summer, Margaret did something she'd been thinking about for months. She bought a plane ticket to Tel Aviv. To meet Ruth. They'd been talking on the phone regularly, every few weeks, sometimes more. Ruth would tell her stories about Elena as a child. Margaret would tell Ruth about the woman her mother had become. But they never met in person. Until now. Margaret stood outside Ruth's apartment building, her heart pounding. She rang the bell. The door opened. And there she was. Ruth Steinberg. 93 years old. Small and frail, but with eyes that burned bright with life. She looked at Margaret. And she smiled. "You look just like her," Ruth whispered. "Just like Elena." Margaret's throat tightened. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Ruth waved her hand dismissively. "Agreeing? I've been waiting for you." They sat in Ruth's small living room, drinking tea that was too sweet and eating cookies that crumbled in Margaret's hands. Ruth's apartment was filled with photographs. Grandchildren. Great-grandchildren. A life built from the ashes of loss. "I never married," Ruth said, following Margaret's gaze. "But my sister did. She survived too. These are her children. Her grandchildren. My family." Margaret nodded. "Tell me about my mother," she said softly. "Tell me what she was like." Before. Ruth's eyes grew distant. She was fearless, Ruth said. Even as a little girl. She would climb trees higher than any of the boys. She would sneak extra pastries from her father's bakery and share them with the other children. She laughed all the time. Ruth's voice broke. And then the war came. And the laughter stopped. Margaret waited. I saw her the day before she left. Ruth continued. My mother and I were being taken to the trains. To their Scienstadt. Elena was standing in the street with her mother. She was crying. She reached for me, but the soldiers pushed her back. Ruth wiped her eyes. I thought I would never see her again. And I was right. I didn't. But now, she looked at Margaret. Now I see her in you. And I know she lived. I know she was happy. And that's enough. Margaret reached across the table and took Ruth's hand. She was happy, Margaret said. She really was. She built a beautiful life. She loved my father. She loved me. She gardened and baked and sang quietly to herself when she thought no one was listening. Ruth smiled through her tears. That's the Elena I remember. The one who sang. They sat together in silence, two women connected across decades, across oceans, and across the unbridgeable gap between survival and escape. Do you ever wish you'd left too? Margaret asked quietly. Instead of going to the camps? Ruth finished. Margaret nodded. Ruth thought for a long moment. No, she said finally. Because if I had left, I wouldn't have survived. Not really. Your mother survived by leaving. I survived by staying. We both did what we had to do. And we both lived. She squeezed Margaret's hand. That's what matters. Not how we survived. But we did. Before Margaret left Israel, Ruth gave her something. A small wooden box. I kept this all these years, Ruth said. I didn't know why. I thought maybe one day I would find Elena again. But I never did. So now I give it to you. Margaret opened the box. Inside was a child's bracelet. Tarnished silver. With a tiny charm in the shape of a star. Elena gave this to me the day before I was taken, Ruth said. She said, so you'll remember me? I wore it in the camp. I wore it until it almost broke. Then I put it away. To keep it safe. Margaret's vision blurred. Ruth, I can't. You can't, Ruth said firmly. Because it belongs with the necklace. They're a pair. Two pieces of the same story. Margaret closed her fingers around the box. Thank you, she whispered. Ruth smiled. Thank you, Elena. She was the brave one. She's the one who lived freely. I just survived. You both did, Margaret said. In different ways. But you both did. On the flight home, Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Ruth's words. She was the brave one. But was she? Or had her mother spent 60 years running from the very thing Ruth had faced head-on? Margaret pulled out her laptop and opened a blank document. She started typing. Dear Mom, I found your necklace. I know that's not news to you. Wherever you are, you probably know everything now. But I need to say it anyway. I found your necklace. And I found your story. And I need you to know, I'm not angry. I'm not hurt that you didn't tell me. I understand now why you didn't. You wanted me to be free. You wanted me to grow up without the weight of your past pressing down on my shoulders. You wanted me to laugh without wondering if I had the right to be happy. You gave me that gift. But Mom, I need you to know something too. Your past wasn't a burden. It was a treasure. It was proof of your strength. Proof of your courage. Proof that even when the world tried to destroy you, you refused to let it win. You didn't just survive, Mom. You thrived. You built a life full of love and joy and quiet, beautiful moments. You sang. You gardened. You baked cookies and read me bedtime stories and held my hand when I was scared. You were happy. And that happiness, that was your resistance. That was your way of saying, you didn't break me. You didn't win. I met Ruth, Mom. Your friend. She's still alive. She's 93, and she remembered you. She remembered your laugh and your fearlessness and the way you used to sneak pastries from your father's bakery. She said you were brave, and she was right. I'm wearing your necklace now, every day, and I'm going to pass it down to Sophie, and she'll pass it down to her children. And your story, Elena's story, will never be buried again. Because you mattered, Mom. You mattered then. You matter now. And you always will. I love you. Margaret. Margaret saved the letter. She never sent it anywhere. Because it wasn't meant to be sent. It was meant to be written. To be spoken into the universe. To be a promise. 5 years later, Margaret stood in her mother's old house. It had been transformed. The attic where she'd found the necklace was now a small museum, the Elena Kováč Bennett Memorial Room. It held her mother's journal, the letters, the photographs. And in the center, in a climate-controlled case, the necklace and Ruth's bracelet displayed side by side. The house had become a place of education, of remembrance. School groups came to visit. Families researching their own histories. Survivors and their children, looking for connections, for validation, for proof that they weren't alone. Margaret gave tours twice a week. Today, a new group was arriving. She heard the bus pull up outside. The door opened, and in walked 30 teenagers, led by a teacher Margaret didn't recognize. She smiled and introduced herself. Welcome. My name is Margaret, and this was my mother's house. Her name was Helen Bennett. But before that, her name was Elena Kováč. And this is her story. She told them everything. About Prague. About the war. About the necklace hidden beneath the floorboards. She told them about silence and survival. About the weight of memory and the courage it takes to let go. About the difference between forgetting and forgiving. When she finished, a boy in the back raised his hand. Do you think your mom would be happy? That you're telling her story now? Margaret smiled. I think she'd be terrified, she said honestly, because she spent her whole life hiding. But I also I hope she'd be proud, because her story matters. And now, it won't be forgotten. A girl near the front spoke up. My great-grandmother survived the camps. She just died last year. She never told anyone what happened. The girl's voice broke. I wish I'd asked. Margaret walked over and knelt beside her. It's not too late, she said softly. Talk to your family. Ask them what they remember. Record their voices. Write down their stories. Because even if your great-grandmother didn't tell you herself, someone in your family knows something. And those pieces, those fragments, they matter. The girl nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you. That evening, Margaret sat alone in the memorial room. The sun was setting, casting golden light through the window. She looked at the necklace in its case. And she thought about her mother. About Elena. The girl who had fled with nothing but a false name and a pearl necklace. The woman who had built a life from ash and silence. The mother who had loved fiercely, quietly, without ever asking to be seen. Margaret touched the glass of the case. I see you now, Mom, she whispered. I see you. Sophie arrived a few minutes later, her own daughter, Margaret's granddaughter, in tow. Little Emma was 7 years old. Bright-eyed and curious. She ran up to Margaret and hugged her legs. Grandma, can I see the necklace? Margaret smiled and lifted Emma into her arms. Of course, sweetheart. They stood in front of the case together. Emma pressed her nose against the glass. It's pretty. Whose was it? It belonged to your great-great-grandmother, Margaret said. And before that, her mother. And before that, her mother. Emma's eyes widened. That's a lot of mothers. Margaret laughed. Yes. Yes, it is. Will it be mine someday? Margaret looked at Sophie, who nodded. Yes, Margaret said. Someday. When you're older. And when it is, I'll tell you all about the woman who wore it first. About Elena. And about how she was brave enough to survive. Emma smiled. I can't wait. Margaret walked Sophie and Emma to the door. As they were leaving, Sophie turned back. Mom? Yes? Do you think Grandma knows? About all of this? About the museum and the documentary and everything? Margaret thought about it. I don't know, she said. But I hope so. I hope wherever she is, she knows that her story mattered. That she mattered. Sophie hugged her. She definitely knows. After they left, Margaret walked back into the memorial room. She sat in the chair by the window and looked at the necklace one more time. And she thought about forgiveness. About the words scratched into the clasp. Forgive me, Elena. Her grandmother had asked for forgiveness. For giving Elena a burden she couldn't carry. But Elena, Helen, had forgiven her. By hiding the necklace, she'd let go of the past. And by letting go, she'd survived. Margaret understood that now. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about choosing to live in spite of the pain. It was about saying, what happened to me will not define me. It was about building a life, a beautiful, ordinary, unremarkable life, and finding joy in it. That was the lesson. That was what her mother had been trying to teach her all along. Not through words, but through the way she lived. 10 years after finding the necklace, Margaret published a book. It was called The Necklace Beneath the Floorboards, a daughter's journey into her mother's hidden past. It became a bestseller. Not because it was sensational, but because it was true. Because it was one family's story, small, intimate, heartbreaking, and ultimately hopeful. Readers saw themselves in it. They saw their own grandparents, their own parents. They saw the silence they'd grown up with and finally understood why. Margaret received hundreds of letters. From children of survivors who had never known their parents' stories. From survivors themselves, grateful that someone was telling the truth. From teachers who used the book in their classrooms. From people who had found hidden treasures in their own attics. Letters, photographs, journals, and didn't know what to do with them. Margaret answered every single letter. Because she understood now. This wasn't just her story. It was everyone's story. It was the story of survival. Of memory. Of the things we bury because they're too heavy to carry. And of the courage it takes, for us, for our children, for the generations that come after, to dig them up again. Margaret lived to be 83. She spent her final years in the house where her mother had hidden the necklace. She gave tours. She told stories. She listened. And when she died, peacefully in her sleep, with Sophie and Emma beside her, she was wearing the necklace. It was buried with her. Not hidden this time, but honored. A symbol of the past. A bridge between generations. A reminder that we are all connected by the stories we carry. Sophie took over the memorial room. Emma, now a historian herself, helped catalog new donations. And the necklace, the one Margaret had been buried with, was replaced in the display case with a replica. But beneath it, a new placard was added. This necklace represents 4 generations of women. Elena survived by fleeing. Anna survived by hiding. Helen survived by forgetting. And Margaret survived by remembering. Each carried the weight in her own way. Each found strength in letting go. And each, in the end, chose life. The story of the necklace teaches us something profound. That survival takes many forms. Sometimes it means holding on. Sometimes it means letting go. Sometimes it means burying the past so we can build a future. And sometimes it means digging up that past so we can finally understand who we are. But always, it means choosing to live, to love, to continue. Even when the weight feels unbearable. Even when the world has tried to break us. We survive. Not just by breathing, but by building lives full of meaning, joy, and quiet acts of resistance. By singing when they told us to be silent. By loving when they tried to teach us hate. By living, fully, beautifully, bravely, when they wanted us to disappear. That is the lesson of the necklace. That is the lesson of Elena. That is the lesson we must never forget. Here's a final takeaway for you, my listener. The heaviest thing we carry isn't the weight of what happened to us, it's the weight of keeping it hidden. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is let someone else help us carry it.